Okay, so I decided to do my project on the Native American culture. So the Native Americans were spread out roughly around all of America, and they even went up into Canada and also into Mexico. So there was about 10 to 90 million Americans that were first in the United States. They spread all of America with hundreds of tribes, and they had to adapt to the land. They learned to be good fishermen, and they farmed crops and built homes, which made them to learn to survive. The Native Americans were very welcoming at first to the settlers, and even without them, they wouldn't have survived. A little fun fact also, Christopher Columbus gave them the name the Indians because he had thought he had landed in the Indies. So at first, the Native Americans did welcome the Europeans. They gave them food, hospital care to help them survive on the land. They even tried to coexist with them, but the Europeans decided that they wanted the land all to themselves. The fight had began over the land, but the main problem for the Indians was the disease that they had brought over from Europe. Not only did they have weapons, but they also had this disease that they had never seen before, such as measles, smallpox, cholera, and yellow fever. Most of the Native Americans were also taken out from disease in the actual battle. So one of the worst massacres that ever took place before the disease took over would be the Wounded Knee Creek. So the massacre took place with taking out the warriors, the women, the children, and just taking them all out, basically is what happened. This led to the Trail of Tears, where hundreds of Cherokee died due to illness. They also forced the children to leave their homes and try to send them to schools to what they called civilize them. When they did this, the children lost their heritage and they couldn't go back to where they used to live. There are about 150 native languages that are unique to the native tribes and are still spoken today. But they are slowly beginning to die out because most people are taught to train and learn English since it is one of the most spoken languages that they have here in America. Around 73 of those ages 5 or older only speak English in today's time, which is losing their culture of their language. Many stereotypes, one of the main ones is tomahawks and knives, which is a stereotypical violence. This makes them seem violent than what they actually were. For most part, the Indians were just trying to protect their land from the European settlers who were trying to take over. But the way the history says it, saying that they scalped people and whatnot, makes them seem more violent than they actually were. Another stereotype would be mascots. This is very offensive to the Native Americans because it's using their culture as something that people think would be representing something fearless and good, but that's not what they want to be remembered for. They wanted to be remembered for what they were and how they took care of the land and they learned to survive. And another stereotype is when it comes to trying to sell items. They put pictures of Indians and the Native Americans on cigarettes, food, plants, and herbs because they think it'll appeal to the eye of the people when they see that it was used by Native Americans. When it comes to culture, many tribes have created language learning programs to help and preserve their language since it is slowly dying out. This way they can keep it going and not have to always learn English. For ceremonies, this was another way of showing their culture. When they did ceremonies, they were performing and showing how to live with their dignity, character, and pride. And then their religion was based on the spiritual idea that the universe and objects have souls and spirits. The Native Americans worshipped animals, plants, the sun, rain, and wind spirits because that's what they believed what controlled the world that they lived in. When it came to relationships, all the adults had to be married, but when it came to being married, there was no religious ceremony at all, only a public recognition of the fact of marriage. In most cases, there was no formal ceremony at all. The way that people knew is that simply the people had started living together. Another thing was that polygamy was very common in this time of the Native Americans. They did this so that everybody could be married and that the more people they had in a household was better. Which also is why when divorce was so accepted and was normally indicated by the women, but children were never affected by divorce because they had so many parents with these polygamy families that they never felt left out because they didn't have just one mom or dad. Gender roles. So the women's gender roles was to do the farming, collecting wood. They preserved all the meat. They, made clothes for the children, and they also took care of the children. Whereas their main priority was hunting, though they did help when they weren't hunting for clearing the fields. They completed the ceremonies, and they also helped with war making. But for the most part, women did most of the work when it came down to it. The men mainly hunted, and when they weren't doing that, they helped around. So for communication, the biggest thing for the Native Americans is they were a very silent and quiet tribe. Part of their culture was actually to remain silent and to not express any emotion. They would rather listen than to speak. Another way, though, that they did do this was they did storytelling. That was the main way that they did any kind of communication. It was the way to pass down their history and experiences to go so that it could be passed down through history and from generation to generation. Children were not allowed to speak in front of adults. It was considered inappropriate, and it was also not allowed for anybody to speak for another person. And also, it was not appropriate to be verbally disciplined or praise your child in public or to express any emotion in public. That includes verbally and non-verbally. So societal dues, it is really important to listen to the Native Americans when they are talking and to not interrupt them. They take that very seriously since it is a part of their culture. And you are always to speak softly and never to raise your voice. Another thing would be to discuss the variety of Native Americans. It is important that you don't just associate the Native Americans all as one tribe. There are hundreds of tribes that one Native American to belong to. You were supposed to respect that the way that they lived in harmony. They didn't want to be known as violent and to be ones who were always at war. And another thing is you need to respect their culture and land. They have reservoirs that they live on now, and that's very important to them because it took a long time for them to actually acquire that. And then societal don'ts, should not allow your children to dress up as Native Americans. It is very offensive to them, and it's just not something that they really enjoy seeing. It goes for the same for mascots as well. You don't need to associate all American Indians with casinos. Not all Native Americans agree with the Native cultures having casinos. They think it is a way for them to make money, and they don't always agree with that, and they should just be able to live on with the culture that they had. And don't always assume that they speak English. They are trying to carry on their language that they have for their tribes, but sometimes they don't speak English, especially the older generation. And also do not call them Indians. That is very offensive to them. They like to be known as Native Americans.